So around a year ago, I made a video where I read all of the books that had been chosen as Waterstones Books of the Year in 2022, and I'm going to be doing a similar video again this year. However, instead of reading the thriller books like I did last year, I'm going to be reading the general fiction books. So these books, I guess, would fall under literary fiction. Some of them have contemporary settings and some of them have more historical settings, but what I really enjoyed about doing this vlog last year was how it introduced me to a lot of books that I wouldn't have read otherwise. Because I watch a lot of BookTube, that's where I tend to get most of my recommendations from, and it's fun sometimes, I think, to read books that don't get as much hype online. Some of these books have been hyped online though, which you'll see as we get into the vlog. But yeah, I have now read the first 3 books that were chosen for January, February and March. So I'm gonna start by going through my thoughts on those books, and then I'll do check-ins after every 3 books. So it's almost like we're doing this by season. January's book of the month was Godmersham Park by Gill Hornby, which I had never heard of before doing this challenge, but I read this one quite recently and I ended up really enjoying it. I gave it 4 stars and I would consider reading other books by this author. This is historical fiction that follows a woman called Anne Sharp, who was the governess of Jane Austen's niece. So Anne was a real person, and I really appreciated that this was fiction that's based on a real person's life. So there's an author's note at the end where Gill Hornby talks about what actually happened and what was fictionalized for the purpose of the book. I think if you have no interest in Jane Austen, then you might find this one a little bit boring. Nothing really happens much in this book. It's more of a character study, but I found Anne a really interesting person to learn about through the context of this book. The writing style felt like it was inspired by Jane Austen, but it wasn't copying directly or trying to be a Jane Austen book. And yeah, I really appreciated that. It has reminded me that I really need to read more Jane Austen books because I've still only ever read Pride and Prejudice. I have some of her other books, but I haven't got round to them, and I've owned them for literally half my life. So yeah, really enjoyed the nostalgic feeling that this gave me because Pride and Prejudice was one of my favourite books when I was a teenager. Would definitely recommend this one if it sounds like the kind of thing that you'd enjoy. Moving on to February's book, which was Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Mellors. So I keep wanting to call this one Coco and Frank, and that's not the name of the book, but this follows Cleo and Frank, who meet on New Year's Eve. It's set in New York City as well, which I really enjoyed, but these 2 people meet on New Year's Eve and they have a whirlwind relationship which results in them getting married 6 months later, partly because Cleo is from England and needs a visa to stay in New York, but also because they're in love. I was very nervous going into this because I'd heard comparisons to Sally Rooney's books, and I've only read Normal People by Sally Rooney, but I did not like it, so I was a little bit nervous that I wasn't going to enjoy this, but I ended up giving it, I think, a 4 stars. I literally finished it last night, so I'm still trying to work out what my final rating is going to be, but I found this really compulsively readable. Every time I picked it up, I struggled to put it down, and I think that needs to count for something, even though when I actually dissect this book, there were some parts that I found really frustrating and some parts that I actually didn't like. I don't feel like I got the feeling from this book that I was meant to get. So there were times where I felt like the author was trying to give commentary on stuff, and there were parts that did resonate with me, but there were also parts where it felt like it stopped before going deeper, and I did find that frustrating. You do get the perspectives of other people who know Cleo and Frank, so they're friends and family members, and some of the side characters I actually preferred to following Cleo and Frank, and I don't know whether I was meant to feel that way. Some of the side characters' stories weren't wrapped up in a very satisfying way, which again was really frustrating. I feel like that just summarises my thoughts on this book, is that while I couldn't put it down, I also found it really frustrating and I was left wanting more. This is the kind of book that I can see some people describing as boring because it doesn't have a plot. It is more about the characters' relationship. I don't think I mentioned actually, but there's quite a big age gap between Cleo and Frank. So she is, I think, 24 at the start of the book and Frank is in his early 40s. The characters weren't likeable, but I also don't think they were meant to be likeable. I did find that they had enough depth where I was still interested in seeing what was going to happen to them next. But yeah, I think this could have gone further than it actually did. Content warnings for drug and alcohol abuse in this, and also suicide and mental health related struggles. But again, like I said, I felt like it didn't go as deep as I would have liked it to, considering it was focusing on some very heavy topics. It's a difficult book to recommend, but I think if you enjoy books that feel a little bit pretentious and that focus on characters and that follow them through a short period of their lives, then this might work for you. Like I said, I gave it 4 stars, but I'm questioning whether it's more like a 3 or a 3.5. So next up we have Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus, which was March's book of the month, and I did actually read this a few months ago. It's a book that I would have read anyway because I bought it last year when it was getting a lot of hype and I have since unhauled this. I gave it to my mum because I unfortunately didn't like this book, but I think she might like it, so I'd rather give the book to her than keep it in my collection. But I think your enjoyment of this book really depends on how you feel about the main character Elizabeth, because it's basically the story of her life and her career as a scientist in the 1950s and 1960s. I think you learn very early on, like in the first chapter, that she had to leave her job working in a lab, and she now works as the presenter of this TV show that's kind of about cooking, but it's really about teaching women science. So I really liked the concept of this. I thought it sounded like it would be my kind of thing, but I hated Elizabeth. I think this would have felt more satisfying to me if she had acknowledged the status quo, but gone against it anyway. Instead, she was acting really clueless and like she had no idea that she was in the 1950s or 1960s. And that didn't feel very believable to me. When I read a book that has a historical setting, I want to feel grounded within that time period, and the writing in this just felt kind of lazy to me. I also don't think the marketing for this book is quite accurate because I went into this expecting it to be really light-hearted and funny, but I didn't find that at all. Like, there is an on-page rape scene within the first 30 pages or so, and it made me really angry because I don't personally feel like it was necessary. I think this was actually voted the Waterstones Best Book of the Year last year, so I went into it with really high expectations, but yeah, it didn't work for me, and I know that my opinion is the unpopular one because I have seen so many positive reviews for this book, but yeah, it's one of my most disappointing books that I've read this year. So those were the books that were chosen for January to March in 2023. I will check in with you once I've read the next 3 books. I am actually going down to Brighton tomorrow for work, so I'm going to be reading on the train there and back, and possibly while I'm in the hotel, but I will try and include some footage of Brighton if I remember and if the weather isn't terrible. It's currently raining today, so if you heard that in the background, then I am sorry if it was distracting. But yeah, I will check in with you once I've read the books for April, May and June.
I've been waking up too early just to lose some more sleep. I've been hiding from my pride, well I'm looking for a change. Oh, but what if I change my mind? Will I find my wasted time? There's somebody I look up to, I could only hope to be. If we had the conversation, I know exactly what he'd say to me.
There is a possibility that I have chosen the worst possible day to film this update because it's very dark and moody outside, but I'm hoping that the lighting is okay. We're just going to roll with it because I have now finished the next 3 books that I needed to read for this vlog, and I'm going to go through them now. I'm also going to do a run-in summary of the books that I've read for this vlog so you can see how I would rank them in comparison to each other. But let's start by going through my thoughts on April's book of the month, which was Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. This is actually my favourite book that I've read so far for this challenge. I gave it 5 stars, and it's a book that I feel quite comfortable recommending to most people. I think with any book, it really depends on your taste, but this is one where I feel like it has wider appeal. So this is set in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, and we follow a young woman called Kushla, who I think is 24 at the start of the book, and she lives with her mother, who's an alcoholic. She works as a school teacher, teaching primary school kids, and in the evenings she helps out behind the bar in her family's pub, and it's while working at this pub that she meets this guy whose name I can't remember, but he is married and he's Protestant, and he's also much older than her, but they begin this affair, and I've seen this described as a love story. I didn't really interpret it that way. I found this more of a realistic exploration of something that could have actually happened. I didn't feel like it was romanticising their affair. Kushla to me was a really interesting character to follow because she felt a little naive at times, but not in a way where I found her unlikable. I actually found her a really strong character to follow, and I think that it's difficult when you're reading about a character who is in their early 20s. I think it's difficult not to be able to relate to them, or at least that's what I find because I'm now in my 30s. I think that she was written in a way that felt really realistic. The writing style for this made me feel a little bit nervous at first because it's written without speech marks, so there is dialogue where characters are interacting, but there's no speech marks, and the only other book that I've read like that is Normal People by Sally Rooney. So after the first few chapters I was a little concerned that I wasn't gonna get on with the writing style, but I really liked the writing in this. I felt like it was quite blunt at times, which really worked for this type of story. The atmosphere as well also felt a little unsettling and uncomfortable. There were times throughout this where there was just this tension, and I felt like I was on edge because it felt like something bad could happen at any time. I was really surprised to find out that this is actually a debut, but I will will definitely be looking out for more books by this author. Moving on to May's book of the month, which was Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow. So this is a multi-generational story. It's kind of historical fiction, but also the timeline kind of jumps all over the place. But basically this is following 3 women within this same family. We have Hazel, who is the mother of Miriam and August, who are sisters, and then Joan and Maya are Miriam's daughters. So there's a lot of different characters, but I did find it quite easy to distinguish between the characters and follow everything that was happening to each of them. The book opens with Miriam and her daughters returning to Miriam's childhood home in Memphis, where her sister still lives, because Miriam's husband has been abusive towards her. And I will say, I didn't check trigger warnings before I started reading this, and I really wish I had, because alongside domestic abuse, there's also a traumatic assault involving a child, and I really wish that I had known that going into the book, because I wasn't expecting it. It felt like it kind of came out of nowhere because it was talked about right at the start of the book, and it just completely jolted me. So yeah, just something that I wanted to mention if you have been interested in this book. But this was a really difficult book to review just in general. I felt really invested in these characters, and they were written in a way where I could really feel their strength and determination. However, I didn't like the fragmented timeline. So the timeline jumps around a lot. One minute you'll be in the 1990s, and then the next you're in the 1960s, and then you're back to the 1990s, but then you go back to say the 1920s, and I found it easy enough to follow, but every time it changed perspective or it changed to a different time, it did take me out of the story a little bit, and I think that's the main reason why I gave this 4 stars instead of like a 4.5. I also found, because it was quite short, there were parts where I wanted a little more emotional depth, and I didn't really get that. There were aspects which I think could have been explored further, and so it ended up feeling a little bit flat. There were a few side characters who I really liked, and I wanted to learn more about them, and I think that's a good thing because it showed how invested I was. But I got to the end and I felt like it should have been more impactful than it actually was. It just kind of ended. So yeah, I thought this had a lot of potential, but it ended up feeling just kind of okay to me. I am going to give it 4 stars rather than like a 3, because I did really like it for the most part, and I'm glad that I read it. But yeah, I just wanted more from the story. Next up we have June's book of the month, which was Trust by Hernan Diaz, and I was so excited for this book. I saw that it was set in New York in the 1920s, and I thought, yes, this sounds like something that I'm gonna love. But I almost DNF'd this book several times, and I'm glad that I continued, because I got to the end and I could see what the author was trying to do, but I found this so boring. I'm not going to go into too much detail on what this book is about, because I feel like that in itself could be considered a spoiler, but basically all you need to know is that it's set in New York in the 1920s, and it's the story of a married couple where the husband made a lot of money during the Wall Street crash, and people are really confused how he continued to be successful when everyone else was really struggling. And then his wife is also really interesting. She's very well educated. She lived in Europe as a child, and it's essentially about this married couple, kind of. The book is split into 4 parts, and my journey while reading it was, I hated part 1. It felt like a really dull biography, which I think was kind of the point. Part 2 2 I also found boring, but at least it was relatively short. And then I got to part 3 and I really liked part 3. And also part 4 I enjoyed, but I felt like it could have done more than it was actually doing. I know I'm sounding really vague, but I'm really trying not to spoil this book. I got to the end, like I said, and I appreciated what the author was trying to do, but I think this book relied on having an interesting structure when the actual contents were just kind of flat. It wasn't in any way compelling to me, and if I hadn't been reading this on a train to Brighton where I had nothing else to do, then I probably would have put it down and not picked it back up. So those were the books for April, May and June. I will catch up with you once I've read the books for July, August and September.
Terrible things started happening when you walked away. So that's why I stay right here. Cause when all of my dreams seem so out of reach, you're crystal clear. You don't disappear, baby. No. So why would I follow you?
So I realised after I filmed my last update that I've already read the book of the month for July. I read it earlier this year before I even started this challenge, and on top of that, when the November book was announced, I saw that it's a short story collection that's only around 200 pages. So basically there's been a change of plan. Instead of filming 2 separate updates, I'm gonna combine them into one and just talk about the remaining 5 books that I've now read for this challenge. There isn't a book for December. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet in the vlog, but Waterstones do their books of the year in December, so they skip their books of the month. Kicking things off then with July's book of the month, which was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This book was everywhere last year. I saw so many people talking about how it's one of their favourite books of the year, and so that's why I picked it up. I think it was in March. I read it over the course of a weekend. I didn't even vlog my time reading it because I started it, and next thing I knew I was halfway through, and then I just wanted to finish it because there was something so compulsively readable about the story. I can understand why not everyone has enjoyed it because the 2 main characters aren't that likeable, but they're not meant to be likeable, or at least that was my interpretation. But this is basically following 2 characters, as I said, Sam and Sadie, who meet when they're kids and they bond over their love of video games. Then something happens and they stop talking for a few years until they end up going to colleges within the same location, and they meet by chance in a train station and they reconnect and they start making video games together. So the book spans a few different decades. I think it starts in the 80s, but most of the book takes place in the 90s and early 2000s. So it gave me that nostalgic feeling, and I think that's why I enjoyed it so much. It also felt really unique and unlike anything that I've ever read before. I loved how I felt so immersed in this world of video gaming. Weird comparison, but it reminded me a little bit of when I read Daisy Jones and the Six, because that book is about this rock band creating an album, and it's something that I obviously don't know anything about, but I loved being immersed in that process, and I felt a similar way reading Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I would recommend checking content warnings if you are interested in this book, because there was a lot of content that I was not expecting. Sadie experiences a lot of sexism because she is a woman working in a very male-dominated industry in the 90s. As I said earlier, the characters are not always likeable. They do feel quite frustrating at times. However, I also felt like I was reading about real people, which is something that I enjoy in this type of book. I gave this 4.5 stars. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet, but in terms of where I'd rank this overall, I would place it in second place behind Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. Even though I didn't give this the full 5 stars, it is a book that has stuck with me long term, and I think that even if you don't love video games, then you might still get something out of it because it does focus on this complicated platonic relationship. Next up we have The Whalebone Theatre by Joanna Quinn, which was August's book of the month, and this was the most surprising book that I read for this challenge because I hadn't really heard much about it before picking it up. I knew that it was historical fiction, and I knew that it was set kind of in between World War I and World War II, but it also spans several decades. So it starts in the 1920s and then it goes into World War II. It's described as a sweeping family saga set in Dorset in England, and we're following this main character, actually a few different characters, but the main character is called Christabel, and she is considered a slightly eccentric and strange child. Her father remarries when she's 4, and her stepmother kind of ignores her and doesn't really want much to do with her. So Christabel is left to her own devices, and when she's 12, a whale washes up on the beach near her home, and she, with the help of this artist who's visiting town, she creates this theatre within the body of this whale. I don't feel like I've done the best job of explaining that, but basically this artist originally came to town to paint this whale. However, he ends up inspiring Christabel to take an interest in the arts, and in particular in the theatre. The second half then takes place during World War II when Christabel is an adult, and this is about the role that she takes in the war, and it's also got a big focus on sibling relationships, which I think is what I enjoyed the most. I felt really invested in these characters, and even though this is quite slow, it's also quite long. I think it's over 500 pages. I read it at the perfect time because I was away in this cabin near the Cotswolds and I had the time to dedicate to reading, and there was just something about these characters that I found really endearing, and yeah, I gave this one a solid 4 stars, maybe actually more like a 4.5. It was pretty much exactly what I was expecting, which is one of the main criticisms that I've seen. I can imagine if you've read a lot of World War II fiction, then you might find this a little boring because it doesn't really feel fresh and it doesn't really offer anything new. But I did really warm to the characters and I cried so many times. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but this did make me feel quite emotional, and it had this bleak atmosphere which I think really worked for me. I would describe this as Downton Abbey meets The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I think those aren't perfect comparisons, but if you liked both of those and you're looking for a book that captures the essence of those two combined, then you might enjoy this one. Next up we have September's book of the month, which was In Memoriam by Alice Winn. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see on the cover, but this was actually the Waterstones debut fiction prize winner, and I have seen this book around a lot. I don't think I actually knew what it was about, but I was intrigued because I really like the colour combination on the cover. But this is basically described as a love story between 2 soldiers in World War I. These 2 young men, Gaunt and Elwood, have been friends for most of their lives because they attended the same boarding school, and I liked this book. I feel like it wasn't quite what I was expecting, because even though I liked the characters, I think I assumed that the love story was going to be more of a slow burn, and it's not really, and a lot of the foundation of their relationship takes place before the start of the book. So I didn't feel as invested in them as I think I should have. However, as a book, I thought this was very powerfully written. It's really a story about what life was like for these men in the trenches, and there were some descriptions in this book and some scenes which I don't think I'm ever going to be able to forget. I wouldn't say that I enjoyed this aspect, but the element that I appreciated the most was the way that Alice Winn showed the impact that this war had on these men and the PTSD that they went through and the way that it affected their mental health. It's a really difficult book to rate because I was quite frustrated at certain points in this book. There's a big lack of communication between the two main characters, which I understood given the time period. However, it didn't stop me from finding it frustrating. There's also quite a few side characters that I struggled to keep track of. However, there was a point in this book where things took a turn and it started going in a direction that I wasn't expecting, and I think that's the point where I felt hooked. Some parts did still feel a little bit contrived and convenient. However, overall, I can understand why this book has been so popular and why it's getting so much hype, and I did give it 4 stars overall, maybe a 4.5. In terms of my rankings, I would put it alongside The Whalebone Theatre in 3rd place. October's book of the month was Really Good Actually by Monica Heisey, which I think is marketed as like general contemporary fiction. I was actually going to make a joke about this and say it was really good actually, but unfortunately I found this just okay. I gave it 3.5 stars, however that was mostly because I really enjoyed the audiobook. I was going to read this physically, like I've read all of the books physically. However, I saw the audiobook was narrated by Julia Whelan, who is one of my favourite audiobook narrators. I found it was also available through my local library, so I listened to the audiobook, and I'm glad I went down that route because the audiobook was great, but the actual story was very surreal. Maybe surreal is the wrong word, but this works really well as an audiobook because it's told in first person point of view, and you're basically following this woman who is in her late 20s and she's going through a divorce. She's not coping with it very well, is the best way to describe it. You're essentially watching her go on this downward spiral, and it was so uncomfortable to read. It felt like I was listening to someone read me their unfiltered, unedited, completely raw diary. At the time that I'm filming this, it has a 3.17 average rating on Goodreads, which I am a little surprised at, but also not really, because I think this has a very niche audience. Maggie is not meant to be a likeable character, but it doesn't change the fact that it was quite difficult to follow her life completely falling apart. I think I saw one review compare this to the Black Mirror episode Nosedive with Bryce Dallas Howard, and I can see that comparison because it made me feel so uncomfortable. And I know I've already used that word to describe this book, but that was my overwhelming feeling while I was reading, is that I was uncomfortable. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend this to most people. However, I think if you like millennial fiction in general, or if you like Dorno Porter's books, then that's the closest comparison that I can think of. Not my favourite book of this challenge, but I'd still rank it ahead of Lessons in Chemistry and Trust, which I actively disliked. The final book that I have to talk about for this vlog is Antarctica by Claire Keegan. So I had never read anything by Claire Keegan before, but I know that her books are very popular, And this, I think, originally came out in 1999. However, it's been republished in 2023, and I'm assuming that's why it was chosen as a book of the month. I think I went into this with the wrong expectations because I thought these stories were going to be cozy. I don't know, I just thought that these were going to be cozy winter stories that maybe had a touch of bleakness about them, but like bittersweet. And that's not what this is. These books were sad and dark, and I loved Claire Keegan's writing. I would definitely consider reading more books by her, but I went into this with completely the wrong expectations, but that's my fault. It's not the book's fault. The first short story in this was actually my favourite, and it didn't end how I was expecting. It was very unsettling, and a lot of these stories actually were very unsettling. Overall, as a collection, I didn't love this as much as I wanted to. I gave a couple of the stories 5 stars. So the first short story, Antarctica, was my favourite, but then I also enjoyed Men and Women and Sisters was probably my second favourite. Generally though, the stories in this felt like they had a lot of build-up and then just kind of fizzled out at the end, and because they were quite short anyway, I didn't like how the endings felt unsatisfying. So yeah, I'm gonna give this like a 3.5 stars. I think I would still recommend it. I mean, in particular, I think if you have been interested in Claire Keegan's works, then I felt like this was a good place to start. I really like her writing. I think I might have said that already, but her writing style feels very distinctive. She uses short sentences, but every single word feels deliberate, and I really liked that. So yeah, 3.5 stars, and in terms of where I'd rank this, I'd place it above really good actually, but below Cleopatra and Frankenstein. So that does bring me to the end of this reading vlog. I am going to quickly run through my final rankings, so I'll put the board on the screen so you can see, but in first place we have Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, followed by Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin in second place. Third place was The Whalebone Theatre and In Memoriam. I think those were pretty evenly matched. Godmersham Park comes next, followed by Memphis, Cleopatra and Frankenstein, Antarctica, really good actually, and then Lessons in Chemistry and Trust I would place at the bottom because those were the two that I really didn't enjoy. So yeah, I am really glad that I did this challenge. It was a lot more successful than the similar challenge that I did last year where I read the thriller books. I feel like if I was to do this again, I would read the general fiction books because I enjoyed more books than I didn't enjoy. It also introduced me to a lot of books that I wouldn't have picked up otherwise. I mean, even Trespasses was on my radar, but I don't think I would have prioritised it this year had it not been for this challenge. So yeah, thank you for watching if you made it this far. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books or if you are now interested in any of them. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and click subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me. But otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye.